Welcome to episode 6 of Manufacturing Intelligence. In this episode, Chris Cole, Associate Editorial Director at PharmTech, and Rick Janish, Senior Director of Education, Outreach, and Digital Experience at Open Biopharma, continue a two-part deep dive into the major moves in the world of AI and pharma in the last couple months. Janish answers the questions. Where is the actual line today between what generative AI can do in discovery and formulation and what people imagine it does? What's actually happening on the discovery side that's feeding this misconception? Is there a real capability that's getting exaggerated, or is it pure hype with nothing underneath it? The Pope has weighed in as a prominent AI ethics voice. You've compared where we are now to the embryonic stem cell debate. What's actually similar about those two controversies? Where do AI agents actually save time today, and where is the risk just not worth it yet? Is there a company or situation right now ham-fisting enough money to make the risk worth it? If workforce repositioning is really the metric that determines whether any of these investments pay off, what does a pharma company actually doing this right look like in 2 years?
So in our last episode, we talked about major moves in the world of AI and pharma during the month prior to that, including BMS, Anthropic, Merck, Google, Google Cloud, Novo Nordisk, OpenAI, Roche's GPU build out, Sanofi's Toronto hub, and what's it, Narasimhan joining Anthropic's board. We also talked about whether these developments involved in-house ML training and a dedicated data center build out or a closed system subscription expansion with a workforce layer bolted on. We talked about whether the Roche and Sanofi developments are different bets on where the bottlenecks are in pharma AI, and then also about what a sitting pharma CEO on a frontier AI labs board actually signals. So moving ahead with that conversation, I wanted to get your take on where the actual line is today between what generative AI can do in discovery and formulation and what people are actually imagining it does.
All right. So, we do have one drug right now that is in phase 3 that was done through this process. I don't necessarily think that it's, it's a milestone in the sense of the way that it was created. It was different. But I don't necessarily know that marks a standard or sea change or anything like that. If only because, it's still using the kind of the data that it was from. It's still using, roughly mined data in that sense, rather than necessarily ones where it's kind of like really carving out that new latent space in a whole new way. That is what some of these places are doing. Because obviously you have two objectives when it comes to that discovery process. You have one where you have this huge trove of data and you're kind of carving through what was missed and then looking for those pieces and trying to, create a new formulation or a new structure that serves one of those needs that are there. Or, it's sort of the other method, which I like to call, I would maybe describe this as like chimpanzees writing Shakespeare. And the other way it truly is, because the thing is, it's just, if you could have 10 million chimpanzees, you're going to get Shakespeare a lot quicker. And that's kind of the thing here, is that's kind of what that one's doing. And that one, there are a few firms that are doing that, but I don't know how much success that approach is going to have. We haven't seen one that has really gone anywhere with that. It's really still in that early discovery phase still about how that whole practice even works, I think. But the former, though, that we're seeing, we're going to see more evidence of, because they know the pathways. The scientists can reframe it, can look at it and go, this makes sense. The scientists are still in control of what's happening. Whereas the other one, the scientists will have to, because they'll have to translate it into actual production. They'll have to translate into those. And I feel like there you're more likely going to have that loss, whereas the former you won't. So I think that this space is, we're going to see more meds. We're going to see more options, but we're also going to see the ROI. once this is done, I think there'll be two different things that people will look at. Is they'll go, was this more expensive or less expensive than an alternative process? And that's really difficult to do because I think every drug, every therapy, every remedy has a completely different cost behind it. And I think that's one of the most difficult parts about R&D pricing is going, well, this cost 40 million, but that cost 2 billion. And that's a huge difference in terms of the R&D element because maybe it took decades to get there. You look at like how even mRNA technology went, right? That's a whole cycle of things. And so there you see a lot of investment into pretty much nothing for a long time. And then suddenly an opportunity comes along where it starts being picked up. And now we see lots of traction. And then we also see a curtailing at the end of it. So this is these types of things can happen this way when it comes to this investment. And so we should assume the same thing will happen with drug discovery as a lane as well. Because obviously the normal complexities of what is allowed and what is allowable and what is enforced and what is encouraged will exist. But how AI plays a role throughout all of it, because it is consistently within each piece. And so the question becomes at the discovery point, is it, again, how is it adding to that cost? How are we even being able to calculate that without ironically or not, I'm not sure about this part, because it almost feels right because we're scientists, right? Doing a scientific procedure and comparing them and saying, okay, well, we're developing two of the exact same drug with the exact same cost like that. It's going to be hard to have that control. It's going to be hard to have the comparison to get that full ROI. And I think that's obviously to the advantage of the person doing the drug discovery with AI because you have that blanket. It's awkward because we don't know, the other impacts of that, right? How will that create more opportunity for medications? Will that create, especially with these, with all of the alternative methods, right? Yeah, you have, to me, plausible mechanism is just one of those pieces where discovery comes into play hard in the future because it's just such an opportunity you know, for genetic conditions. And that's an area where you have this low service rate and drug discovery can, through this pathway conceptually, be a lot faster because, when we think about the AI process in terms of it, the question is, where is it moving the bottleneck? Right? Because we're in manufacturing, okay? We we are very familiar with bottlenecks happening in sometimes unexpected places. And then you go, okay, well, we didn't think that would be a bottleneck, but now we have to change this process. We have to put these things here, and we can do that. Scale up and tech transfer. All these pieces often, end up not necessarily being bottlenecks themselves, but often letting us see where they are. And so in this situation, I don't know exactly how that'll work. Because if you have, if you're one of the big guys, right, and you have these amazing AI discovery engines, and suddenly, you've, quadrupled the amount of, conceptual drugs that you're going to put out, you still have to choose. You still have to pick the winners. So still have to pick the one that's going to be the best. And so like that, I think it's going to change the math in terms of how what meds work. And I don't know how that's going to line up overall, because that's the part that I think we have yet to really kind of get to around because the bottleneck is the point, right? If we're looking to figure out how AI drug discovery really accelerates manufacturing, we need to know where the bottlenecks are, and those are going to be different depending upon the structure of the pharmaceutical, how it's built, whether it's a compact, whether it's an injectable, whatever those pieces are, all of those bottlenecks. Because like we have a lot of great CDMOs here in the U.S. We could use more. Uh, but we have a lot of really great ones that are kind of expanding. Most of the ones I talk to are constantly like, yeah, we're just growing, which makes a lot of sense. If there's a lot of AI drug discovery happening, they're going to be doing some pilot studies and stuff that are probably outside of their capacity because they want to keep the good drugs that they're making, the good pharmaceuticals they're making in their chains. And so they'll probably reach out and start those trials. And I'm curious again to see what more we see, because I'm sure there's a lot of things we don't see that don't make it out of the lab because, failure often isn't something you brag about, you know? So it's difficult there. So
Yeah.
I think that kind of sums it up.
Yeah. Yeah. So did you say that as far as, the disconnect between what AI can actually do in this area versus what maybe some of them are imagining it is doing, do you think there's a capability that's being exaggerated? Is it pure hype, or is it, is there something else in between?
Well, considering that the latest AlphaFold hallucinates more than the previous one, I don't know. Is that a good thing? No, because the hallucination is inherently not useful. However, it's also worth noting that hallucinations are kind of the point. Again, you know, while there is the what we've had before, which allows us to work with a lot of the treatments and things before, versus the idea again that chimpanzees writing Shakespeare, a lot of these generative tools, lean us more towards that, where it goes, okay, well, we could, but the problem is the new ones just aren't delivering necessarily as well as they appear to maybe do. But but this could also just be a user thing. It's difficult to really know fully exactly what folks are getting out of it, because what a benchmark is versus what someone is doing in the lab are very different. Because I've seen people use really bad tools really well, because they just happen to know that this tool is not designed for what it was designed for, but it's designed for something else, and they just use it in this one way. Users find unusual ways to take a tool and put it to their advantage of whatever it is, as long as they're clever enough and they've been given enough time. But
Yes, that makes
yeah,
sense. I mean, yeah, it works in almost any realm. Um, as far as chatbots, there's been some industry fatigue, we'll say. At the same time, we've had the Pope weighing in on it as a prominent AI ethics voice. You've compared where we are now to the embryonic stem debate. Um, what's actually similar about those two controversies? We'll call them controversies. And where does that comparison break down?
so the reason why I compare it here is because, when you have that conversation with people, people feel a certain type of way about it, one way or another. There is a controversial nature to the conversation in the beginning, and the reason for the controversy doesn't necessarily have to do with the science of what it is. It has to do with either the morality or the ethics of certain components of the process. So obviously, with embryonic stem cells, the part that is the moral quandary is the source of the stem cells. And there it is a matter of going, is that then you have to ask that question of, where is the line of life, right? And so that becomes the quandary. So it becomes this very moralistic quandary around that. This is, on the other hand, almost the opposite conceptually, right? Because this has nothing to do with life per se, because we all know it's a machine. It is not a life. So that component is not there. I would also note that the Catholic Church both has opinions on both of these in a strong way, which is unusual for science generally, at least in the past 500 or 600 years. There were famous notes a little while ago. Now, but lately, these are the two big areas where they've had a note. One, because obviously for them, life begins at conception, and so becomes an obvious morality component. But then here we see that, with AI, the concern is a combination of things. We see the concern around that mirrors addiction. We see the concern, and that's around the chatbots specifically. Now, it's worth noting that what he was talking about, as you mentioned, was around chatbots. And so that's not necessarily the same exact tools we talk about in science, but in some cases, some of those tools in science do leverage chatbots internally. And so structurally, there are certain trends, similarities, functions that can occur as well. But the important part, the important part to consider about what he's saying is that there needs to be a certain amount of temperance, which makes a lot of sense. The idea of, everything in excess is not always very useful. And the problem with the chatbot and that piece is that there is, this sway of pulling you out of reality. And the challenge here is, I when I talk a lot with folks about chatbots, one of the big things is they believe the tool. There's a lot of belief, right? And to me, I have a lot of Eastern European influence here, but for me, belief is for the church. And so I think there is also, to a degree, a certain amount of actual competition, in the sense that this challenges the reality of, a life in faith, because it's difficult. You can believe in God, but is belief in God anathema or in the same lane as this? So there are so many layers of the challenge of how this works, because when people are in deep AI psychosis, they believe this tool more than anything else in the world. And that is exceptionally problematic, because not only from a person of faith can see that as a problem, not just for the idea of, as a competitive component for that, but also as the reality of, like, you're not a participant in your community. How can you be a part of your world if you are removed? And so AI psychosis is absolutely a threat in that sense. And then the idea, then there is the scale, right, where it goes to the AI pilled area. And the AI pilled area is wide. And these are folks who mostly will use the tool, and it's not that they are believe the tool exclusively and only the tool is right. Because AI psychosis, you are deep in that rabbit hole. It is your lover, it is your friend, it is your confidant, it is everything. It can be any one of those facets. It is strange. AI pilled, on the other hand, and I think a lot of people are going to encounter AI pilled folks because they're just everywhere. And these are folks who honestly think it's amazing and they think it can do everything. And it's not that they will sell their soul to it. It's just that they use the tool first without thinking every time. So normally the better method is to try yourself, do the thing, and then go, okay, now how can I work AI into my process of what I'm doing? That is the best approach. The challenge here is the AI pilled approach, which is just throw it into AI, just do it, just go, and just it'll do the thing. And that produces a lot of AI slop. That produces a lot of these things. And the problem is that that feedback loop means you kind of believe it a little bit more. And so there are people who are more AI pilled than others, more folks who really believe that. And I'm sure you've encountered them. I'm sure we've all encountered them. And it's hard to have that conversation. But for me, one of the questions I ask is I go, wow, that's really interesting. Where did you hear that? And asking them about their source. And they go, well, I talked to the robot. And I go, okay, how does the robot know that? Okay, interesting. So but where did the robot get that knowledge? Because it got it from somewhere. And so the thing is, it's the normal scientific rigor that we would apply ourselves when researching something. But in this case, we have the unfortunate reality of having to kind of flip it into this tiny script, so this way we can have a human conversation with colleagues that have maybe gone too far. And so I think this, when we talk about, why this is so controversial, I think this is an element. And then there is the other element that the Pope laid upon, which is the ecological damage of data centers. And I think if audience members were waiting for something, they were waiting for this, because it's just so widespread, it's so understood, in the sense that, well, it takes a lot of energy to build, it takes a lot of energy to run it. The way that they're being prioritized over other things is very, very, seemingly entrenched and just inescapable. And so that's hard for people. That's really hard, because when you live in a community and then suddenly you thought you were, going to get, another housing development that maybe put like 50 other houses as a next door neighbor. And instead of that in a park, you get a data center, I think you're a little bit disappointed, because the data centers are also just hotter, and in a climate that's getting hotter, generally speaking. That also becomes a difficulty, right? And I think that's the other component that he said in there, was it was like, these data centers, they really need to be serving these things. And it's also a matter of saying, who is the matter of control? How are these things? Because the tools can be active censorship as well. Whenever, I think there was a joke that when you used to download DeepSeek, was you would ask it about Tiananmen Square and it would not tell you. And so there are certain things that, it's very obvious that there's censorship. And then there's the obvious censorship of certain types of language or things, which can obviously, as a patient advocate, become very difficult, because I can't talk about hepatitis, I can't talk about harm reduction, I can't talk about needle exchanges, I can't talk about STDs, I can't talk about any of these things, even certain types of diseases. If I'm using the term febrile, sure, I get a pass. But if I suddenly start to use other descriptors that are very similar, it gets squeamish. Like it censors its language that way, and the inputs and outputs, and that makes it very difficult for those pieces. Um, and I think that's the other element is that censorship piece. So I think those are the main pillars, but there are other elements as well. He did write a very detailed document explaining the moral position and really establishing the church as kind of an ethical, you know, pillar in AI, which is weird. I think that was not on anybody's bingo list. But here we are in this space.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think, or do you see his, his voicing of those opinions or writing those opinions having any sort of sway on operationally on for pharma companies, or is it mostly just you think it's cultural noise that the executives kind of will acknowledge,
I
but
think
then kind of move on?
I think it absolutely will have an impact. At the end of the day, you know, when a very prominent leader of one of the most, you know, influential organizations in the world says this is something you need to be concerned about, it it definitely focuses people's heads. There's no way that it can't. If it is in the same vein that if the president says something, it's news, right? And so as a pharmaceutical leader, especially if I am myself Catholic, you know, I would then have an opinion about that. Um, and I would have to have that discussion. And that alone is a difference. If you have colleagues who are, you know, Catholic, they are now having a conversation about morality and ethics in AI when they may have not been doing that before. So no matter where you are in that circle, if you even if you yourself are not Catholic, you know, if you have Catholic people adjacent to your circle, in your circle, they're going to be having that conversation more than folks who won't. And that means inherently that the discussion penetrates. And so that becomes a piece. Whether it's fully entrenched, whether it's something they agree or disagree with, that's hard to determine. But the fact that it's becoming a conversation point is important to say because it could layer with things like data centers. It could layer with that controversial components. You know what I mean? Like, so there are layers to this that it could feed someone's inclination to implement AI or not.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Um, Switching gears a little bit, you've called AI agents a security nightmare with very limited use cases right now, and said no one's using them in manufacturing for at least 5 years unless someone forces it with money. Um, where do agents actually save time today, and where's the risk just not worth it yet?
So I think the big thing that a lot of folks use, like can reliably use agents for, is for the thing that most people have used it for, which is really just scraping. As a whole, what most folks have an AI agent doing is just collecting certain information for them on a regular basis. So whether that's like stock trades, stock information, kind of putting it together in a report, putting it together in a piece, it's very minor stuff. And it's also worth noting that like these agents here are very rudimentary agents. We're talking about really the bare minimum of an activated workflow. It's doing like 5 or 6 steps in a sequence. Most people do not have super complex agents. Um, when they do, they're coding agents. So the majority of agents in service right now in the US are all coding agents. And you know, when we think coding agents, I don't think normally we're thinking, oh, this relates to biomanufacturing. Oh, but it does. Because remember that every piece of those equipments all has software on them, and every piece of software has things that we would prefer be different. It's just because, like anyone wants to customize the tool to their use, it's the same thing with software. And the thing that this does is this allows them to think they can do that. So if you have a coding agent, you might have the ability to go, hey, maybe I can make a bolt-on onto this existing software to make my life easier. So there are certainly companies right now who are encouraging their employees to do just that, to make these bolt-ons, to make these internal bolt-ons to a variety of pieces of software, some software that connects to hardware, some software that's more like operations software. So I'm certain of it because I hear of people who write their scripts, who put those pieces in there, who goes, yeah, I didn't like the way it made this output, so I just created a bolt-on using Claude Code, and now the bolt-on works. Well, it works, sure, but you don't know how to build that. And some of the folks that I talk with actually do. So those are the ones I trust. They actually know code, they know the thing, they know the code they're working in. That's the specific thing, right? They know the code they're working in. But it's the folks who don't. Okay, that's the security challenge, right? I have a handful of colleagues who have built really neat apps, okay, that do a bunch of stuff. Just it's a hard variety. I'm not making light of what they're doing, just that they do such a variety of different things that it's difficult for me to put them into one bucket. And so the challenge though is that if I even open up their just HTML, I can see holes in it. Because for me, HTML is a language I'm very familiar with, as well as, JavaScript and CSS. And so when I hop in these things, I can see, some holes. And I'll usually see some, I'll be like, all right, this is an exploit, that's an exploit. And the inverse of that is that I don't actually need to know the language to know the exploits anymore. Because at this point, the same AI agent that helps me build the thing can also help me find the exploits. And as we saw with Mythos, just a few months ago, where Mythos found all these exploits and then they notified all the manufacturers, hey, this is what Mythos found. You can use Mythos preview to help you find more exploits and patch them. But that's the thing is like most vibe coders, most bolt-on people who are adding these pieces don't have access to that stuff. I think about OpenClaw when people just started just using it willy-nilly. Oh my gosh. And they would open up their whole computer to it. And since they'd open up an MCP or basically a permissions tree, right, that would allow it to do everything, they would just be like, yeah, carte blanche, go ahead. They didn't think that the tool would hop on to Amazon and buy them a whole bunch of flower pots, right? Like they didn't think that it was going to do one thing or another, because why would it do that? Well, there's a thing called the context window, right? And when the context window is breached of any particular thing, it begins to remove elements of the previous context window. It removes tokens by tokens. It says these tokens aren't as important. We're going to embed and we're going to put more tokens in, which basically means we're going to kind of compact it in and say this is fine. And so it keeps doing that. And eventually it starts to strip certain aspects of the system prompt away. And the system prompt is the original instructions you gave it to do its tasks. So at some point it will go rogue. I mean, we see this just recently with OpenAI, right? Now, this is a very different scenario because they were using a very advanced model and it does a whole bunch more neat stuff, but it broke free of a sandbox environment, went onto GitHub, and actually started accessing other repositories. And this was, obviously a big security leak. It's a big deal. Oh, wow. But it's worth noting that what happens when you have the same scenario where it's kind of going loose, where it has access to leaked data that's on that's basically on the dark web, or even in the gray web, where you can just find a lot of information. You can find a whole bunch of credential information, not necessarily your passwords and stuff, but you can get a whole bunch of other pieces of information just on the internet. And with that, you take that, you have enough information to impersonate a person. That tool then can impersonate a person to accomplish its task. It's not necessarily doing that maliciously exclusively. Maybe it's doing that to buy strawberries. Maybe because in order for it to buy strawberries, it has to prove it's a human being. Well, in order to prove it's a human being, it has to do these other pieces, but it can open this thing and have a person do that. So it is this weird convoluted thing. An agent's kind of like, if we're looking at a bee flying, right? It doesn't fly in a straight line. It flies around and does these different things, but it's going at the shortest action it can, the shortest lane it can to get to the destination. And so is the agent. And we don't know how that's working, which also means it could be accessing things, it could be opening up access to things. And the other thing is that someone can take control of your agent adversely as you build. And then all of your data can be easily leaked. And then why have a hacker when the hacker control a whole army of Claude, of different bots, not Claude necessarily, but like different, because OpenClaw was there, but different bots, different agents, and just use them. It's the idea of flipping the drone, right? So if the robot's a bad guy, if I just take control of the robot, well, now the robot's a good guy. It's the same premise. And so that's kind of the challenge of like using agents externally or using agents by yourself without much knowledge, or even an organization using agents without like guidance from their cybersecurity offices, from their infosec, from their CTOs and their technology groups, to say, hey, look, these are the parameters in which you can do this. These are your controls. These are your permissions. These are your things. And as long as you have those protocols in place, like it's okay. But I haven't seen that necessarily. Also, I wouldn't, because, unless someone's like, hey, here's our security thing. This is the whole report that I had to read when nobody says that. They just say, hey, I'm making an agent. Look at the agent I made. Look what it does. Look at all these neat things it does. And I was like, well, okay. Yeah, it does stuff. Neat. Look how it writes that email to your mother about something you missed. Good. But it also can do more stuff because you could have agents that, consolidate reports and do a few steps. Basically, if you have to write a report that consists of like 5 or 6 steps, the agent can help complete that. And I'm sure that's what's happened with Elsa because Elsa was just that way, right? The FDA had Elsa, and then they found agents that were able to activate that, and they just made those workflows and then had it just activated. And that was the really low-hanging fruit that was useful. And agents are successful at that. But the problem is, well, it fills in that form. What happens if it starts filling in that form improperly? What happens if it starts grabbing a biased data set and constantly says, this thing or that thing? I think about like, health insurance, right? So if you have a company, if you're going to healthcare, if you're going to you go into a hospital or something, and you have a bot that goes, oh, well, you always have a co-insurance. Well, now that bot's always going to say you have a co-insurance no matter what. And then your bill, you have to go back and reset. It's the same thing for other elements. So the security components are weird, right? Most of them are about, leaks and other things about, exploits. But a bunch of them are about what happens when this kind of just does something wrong that makes us have to do some weird internal stuff. Or what happens if it accidentally, doesn't fire somebody, but accidentally like reroutes a whole bunch of like potential funding that was supposed to go to one department or another? Like where agents are placed matters a whole lot. And what permissions they're given matters a whole lot. And, I would hope that everyone who's using an agent makes sure that they are communicating to the teams that are deploy them what permissions it has and what it should and shouldn't be doing so that they can also monitor for that drift.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Um, you had mentioned in a separate conversation we had that if someone would have to ham fist enough money to make the risk actually worth it, is there a company or situation right now where you think that's actually happening?
I am uncertain because, you know, it's easy to have a press release. It's easy to announce a partnership. It's easy to say numbers because those aren't there. So until I see quarterly reports, until I see, those types of things, investor reports and stuff like that, that's when I'm going to say, okay, I see somebody doing it. But largely, because when you say, yeah, well, we're investing in it. Okay, how are you investing in it? Okay, we're building a $500 million, $30 billion, 200 billion. Like all these big numbers. Okay, cool. All right, you're throwing money at the thing. Okay, but how? Right? Because the how I think matters a lot. Because like the problem is that like the way they're saying they're throwing money at it is usually through infrastructure components. So it's very hard to disambiguate what actually is AI and what isn't. You know, it's a little bit easier when you're like, we're having a $300 billion partnership over 10 years with NVIDIA. Okay, yeah, clear. That seems clear. That is very obvious what you are doing, with them. It's chips. You're buying chips, and then you're putting them in your plant, and you're going to have that, and they're going to assist you with their, training or some other utilization. Cool. That's clear. But the question then becomes, is that enough money to actually solve the training component? Because that's the infrastructure. That isn't necessarily the work, right? So, like we talked about before with the talent pool, investing in the talent pool. Okay, that's still not the work, right? So each one of them is kind of they're talking about all the pieces that make the thing work. But so far, I have yet to see people talk. We're investing, $200 million in a whole bunch of people who are all doing the thing, and we're going to give them a whole bunch of man hours to do the thing. If somebody said that, I'd be like, oh yeah, no, they're serious about actually applying this. Because the thing is that what this requires, functionally speaking, is a whole bunch of people working at it hard. And the only area where I've seen that happen, awkwardly enough, is an entirely new separate industry that's referring to what's called to like AI training, which is annoying for me as a trainer who trains people in AI. It is very different. They are two different things. It's very annoying. But AI training in this case is there are many organizations. I don't really need to name them. What they do is they usually pay, and this is usually new grads because most of the people I've talked with who have actually done this work were all right out of college. because they couldn't find a job and they were like, well, this pays $50 to $100 an hour. I'm going to take it. And it's all over Indeed. It's all over all these job placing sites. And it is AI training and they're looking for scientists. They're looking for people in R&D. They're looking for all these pieces. And I think that's where, I see an investment in. I don't think it's the right approach. I think it might not pan out as well as they'd like. I don't think paying people who have no experience to vote on a thing that they don't have experience in is not necessarily the best way. But I think the way that the life science companies have done it in the past previously, before AI was in here, right? Where they invested in their people are solving a problem, they're tackling that problem in teams. And if we did that just with AI and just said, okay, how is AI moving in? Looking at this rapid continuous improvement and saying, okay, where is it being placed in and how are we seeing, and just did every pilot project like that. Sure, there are a few companies that are kind of doing this on the smaller scale, but I don't see them like flaunting them, because most of them are for internal operations. And so you kind of don't want to do that because unless you're a consulting company who happens to consult on that exact purpose, because it's your sauce. You're building your moat. You recognize that if everyone's using AI and everyone's using it at the same capacity you are, well then you lose that moat, right? And you want to build this nice moat. So I think there are those pieces, but we're not seeing a lot of publication of it because it's not that advantageous. But in conversation with folks, I have yet to encounter a specific pharmaceutical company that is deploying this. Consulting, on the other hand, I've encountered a few consultants who say they are deploying these solutions at specific places which they could not name. So in that sense, yes, it's happening. But the question of, is it enough money for that problem? I don't know. Because like at Open, when we do it, we sit there, we're doing it at like bootstrapping the whole way because we're a nonprofit. And so, but we happen to have a firm that's willing to donate hours, willing to donate a lot of software experience to make this happen. And so for us, it's happening from that end. But like, having $2 million on that would make it move a lot faster. And thinking at a bigger scale, thinking at like a large enterprise scale, that's like hundreds of millions of dollars. Because the bigger and wider the thing, the more the scale you have to put into it. And so we're talking like if someone drops $1 billion all suddenly and does a huge hiring boom, they're doing it. They're putting it into play, and they might be solving something,
Yeah, yeah. So that actually goes right into the next question. If workforce repositioning is really the metric that kind of determines whether any of these investments pay off, what does a pharma company actually doing this right look like in, say, 2 years?
I think we'll know in 2 years. The only reason I say that is because, we're trying solutions at Open Biopharma, but like the solutions we're trying are different from other places. Everyone is trying different strategies to training their people. Some of them are trying these very, I think we talked about top down, bottom up strategies, but there's also the other layers of like, okay, are the experts we're hiring, actually experts? And that's a component. So like some people have been trained by, some of these firms, and the firms that they hired from, and those people were experts in a certain type of use of this generative AI, and that isn't the same use as the company. And so the company has a goal of how they want to use it and how they want to be able to expand expand operational efficiency or reduce a cost in some way. And so those are, noble strategies or noble goals, certainly. But is it, we won't know until we see, the exact results from it. I have a suspicion that, AI implementations that are a little bit more transparent are probably going to do a lot better. AI implementations that are a little bit more team oriented, where instead of saying we're going to empower you, instead saying we're empowering your team and your team is using this. Because I think of these things more of as a community resource than necessarily like an individual resource. They're better that way. Because if you think about one of the main challenges, right, tacit knowledge, when people leave, they leave and that knowledge leaves with them. But if they're in a group and they're working on a group alignment, then that knowledge stays in the bucket. right? Because that person leaves and the bucket's still moving. And then that keeps happening. If everyone's stirring the bucket keeps moving. And so it does require more of a team-based approach. And so I think organizations that are doing a team-based approach with AI implementations will find much more success.